distinguished guest, Dr. Rhys Williams. He's the professor and chair of sociology at Loyola University Chicago, where he also directs the McNamara Center for the Social Study of Religion. He has published widely on topics related to culture, religion, and politics in America. He has 2 current research projects in process, one on the cultural politics of immigration to the U.S., particularly focused on anti-immigration social movements, and the second on the role religion plays in the public identities of second-generation non-Christian young adults. He was president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion in 2010 and president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in 2012. He has received distinguished article awards from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in 1992 and the American Sociological Association's section for the Sociology of Religion in 2000. He's now here with us today to speak on creating an American Islam, religious identity, and the second generation. Please give Dr. Rhys Williams a warm welcome.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here. Appreciate the kind invitation. Appreciate the good food. So I have to make sure that I don't have anything in my teeth. This evening, what I'm going to argue, what I'm going to claim, is that there is what I'm going to call an American Islam being created. A version of the faith that aligns in the contemporary United States both organizationally and culturally. Right? Now, this is not in some ways news, right? Many people have said this before, but I'm going to make a contribution, I think, this evening by demonstrating both how it is being done and by whom. Right? To do so, I think we need an understanding of the dynamics between the first and second generation communities and their incorporation into the United States in order to fully grasp this. So, let me begin. At one time, again in the 1850s, again in the 1880s to 1890s, and then again in the 1920s, there was a very active public debate in the U.S. about whether, if at all, Roman Catholics and Roman Catholicism would ever fit into United States society. On one hand, during those times, there were many American Protestant nativists who believed that Catholics could never be, quote-unquote, good Americans because they engaged in social practices that violated what were thought to be American values. For example, they consumed alcohol. And they were suspect in their commitment to American democracy because the claim was that they were part of a religion, part of a religious institution that was arranged hierarchically. That the headquarters for this church was overseas in Rome further raised some suspicions that Catholics' first loyalties lay elsewhere and not to the United States. At the same time, what was at that time called Americanism and the Americanism debate was also controversial within Roman Catholics and Roman Catholicism itself. Many Catholics called for the church to adapt to its American surroundings, recognizing that the political and social circumstances of the U.S. were much different from Europe. But others thought that producing an American version of Catholicism would be diluting the faith, that allowing so-called Protestant elements into Catholic practice would be breaking with sacred tradition. My point is that there are ways in which the United States has been through this before. Right? Because a somewhat similar debate now involves Islam in the U.S. There are people in this country who would argue against the very idea of an American Islam. Perhaps not in this room, but there are these people in this country. Some are non-North American, non-Muslims, who buy into the so-called argument of the clash of civilizations. They believe Islam and Anglo-European culture are incompatible. They're suspicious of Muslims' loyalties, and they worry about whether American religious diversity can stretch far enough to accommodate a new faith. Some of these concerns also stretch to other faiths that are more recent to America, like Hinduism and Buddhism, but of course. Now, whether the religious practices that I have documented in my research to this point, and whether these are a faithful representation of Islam as a faith, I am not qualified to answer. Right? I am not personally Muslim. I don't have the academic or the personal credentials to decide what is a true Islam, what is not a true Islam, what's permissible, what's haram. I don't know. What I'm here to do is to talk sociologically about how the second generation of American Muslims, the sons and daughters of immigrants to this country, and in some cases the grandsons and granddaughters of immigrants to this country, are now building a faith that allows them to be fully Americans and fully Muslim simultaneously. Now, it would be possible to say, well, yes, there is an American Islam, but it's actually not recent. This is not a new thing. And it is true, there have been some Muslims in this country for generations. And there's been a significant African-American Muslim population in the U.S., both in a distinctly U.S. form of the Nation of Islam, as well as in more orthodox manifestations, for decades. Both of those things are true. But I think there's a difference between saying there have been Muslims in the U.S. for a long time, which is clearly true, and saying that there is an American Islam. Right? I think there's a conceptual distinction there, in the same way that the fact that there were Catholics in the United States in 1790 did not really mean there was an American Catholic Church really before the mid to later 19th century. The concept of an American Islam evokes a religiously authentic and culturally legitimate faith that exists relatively unproblematic within its societal context. Thus, I'm claiming, despite the existence of American Muslims for some time, a truly American Islam is the product of the second and third generation of post-1965 immigrants to this country, and it's currently in formation. I believe this is due to three particular factors. Right? Rapidly increasing numbers of Muslim immigrants and their children since 1965. Right? We almost all know that the numbers of immigrants in general have increased rapidly from parts of the world where immigration to this country was not usual before. Pre-1965, most of the immigration to this country came either from Europe or from East Asia. Right? Large-scale immigration from the Middle East, from Africa, from South Asia is a much more recent phenomenon. Second, there are increasing levels of education and middle-class economic status that give American Muslims the resources to begin to make claims on and demand respect from the American public sphere. Right? One thing that we know about the United States is that social class matters. And the extent to which increasing numbers of American Muslims are college educated, increasing numbers are professionals and managers and live in the middle class is an important factor in making American Islam visible and important. And finally, the fact that Islam in the U.S. has captured significant scholarly and literary attention, cultural attention in other ways. In some, it's getting harder for Americans, all Americans, to avoid noticing Muslims in the United States. In fact, I will push to another slide here. We're going to look at several recent book covers from volumes, mostly academic volumes, on Islam in the U.S. Right? Several of these you may have read, several of these you may know. The point I want to make by putting these up here is how much the pictures here call to mind the fact that in the minds of many people, right, Islam is based in immigrants from Arab and South Asian countries. Even if you just look at the pictures on those book covers, you will see African American Muslims remain unrepresented in the dominant public images of Islam in the U.S. In the same way, actually, that they remain underrepresented in our politics, our culture, and our media generally. One of the reasons I think that what often gets called immigrant Islam is now getting attention is that racial segregation in the U.S. and racial isolation in the U.S. made African American Islam of past decades invisible to white Americans. Islam is much less invisible now. I do know, however, that at least for some Muslims, the focus on recent immigration is sometimes uncomfortable. So not long after 9/11 in this country, CARE, right, the Council on American Islamic Relations, had a public relations campaign that was entitled, "I Am an American Muslim." And in that campaign, they had a number of different American Muslims talking about themselves, their family, etc. Several of the people in this public relations campaign emphasized that their own families had been in the U.S. for generations. So they in themselves were deliberately unhooking American Islam from recent immigration, placing it further back in American history. But if we are to think about American Islam as a religious form that has a significant place in the public sphere in this country, it's become a player in community and soon national politics, that has become a significant and widely perceived presence in the American religious mosaic, we need to be turning to the religion being crafted on the ground in community-based organizations by second and third generations of the post-65 immigration. Now, part of my claim tonight is going to rest on public documents, public culture, things anyone can observe. But along with that, I'm going to be reporting on data gathered on young adults and religious organizations through a collaborative effort with Professor Stephen Warner from the University of Illinois, Chicago. We've called this the Youth and Religion Project, and it was ongoing for several years. In this project, we gathered data on a number of different populations of youth and young adults. White, Black, and Latino Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, although more heavily Protestant, as well as Hindus and Muslims. We did individual interviews, mostly college students. We did focus group interviews, usually divided by gender and sometimes faith tradition, sometimes ethnicity or race. Secondly, we spent a lot of time attending worship services, classes, lectures, youth activities at religious organizations that cater to or were run by or seem to attract young people. For that part of the research that involved Muslims, we spent time at several different masjids in the Chicago area and Islamic centers, visited a number of Islamic schools, a Muslim student association in one of the local universities, and other organizations of college-age Muslims, some of whom do community-oriented work. And finally, something that will not be reporting on as much here, we often did family visits, spending time in the home of Christian, Muslim, and Hindu families, learning how they organize their religious lives. But the part I want to talk about tonight mostly are going to be the interviews and the times we spent in religious organizations, because I'm primarily interested in the way that religious organizations, particularly those organizations that are either organized by or run by young adults themselves, help young people to form a public religious identity. Right? How the intersection of organization and identity and the way this helps them assume adult identities. The tendency for young adults to use religious organizations that keeps themselves anchored in the familiar and their family traditions, and also learn how to experiment with the new, the different, and often the diverse. It's particularly true for the second generation. Young adults are negotiating the divide between their parents' culture and the dominant culture which is often represented by their non-co-religion or their non-Muslim college peers, by mass media, by the culture of higher education and the like. One of my undergraduate students at Loyola once told me that he refers to himself and his peers as TCKs. And I said, TCKs? He goes, yes, we are third culture kids. All right? So they're not quite part of their parents' culture. They're not entirely part of American non-Muslim culture. Many of these young people have found a quintessential American form, the Religious Voluntary Association, to be a place where they can express their fidelity to their religious tradition, as well as work out the interpretations of that faith that allow them to live smoothly among their peers. The intersection then of organization and public identity is what I'm particularly interested in. So I'm going to argue that the faith that is being created and practiced in these kinds of organizations and among these people fits in smoothly in American life, both organizationally and culturally. First, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to discuss each in turn, first organizationally, then culturally. But I want to talk just a little bit about the organization of American religion and some of its features. There are several organizational features that are widely regarded as being distinctive about American religion. I'll put several up there. The first is what is considered a congregational structure for religious organizations. What we mean by that is religious organizations in this country tend to be locally organized and responsive to local members. These members build, incorporate, administer, and populate religious institutions. In doing so, particularly when this is done by immigrant communities, they are in control of their religious lives. Right? And this is one area of life where many recent immigrants actually may be in control as opposed to in work and in other ways. So they can use these to revel in their home culture and familiar ways. Right? The extent to which these immigrant associations are formally organized necessarily brings them into contact with American political and civic authorities, with non-Muslim neighbors, with business organizations. When you build a local Islamic center, you may be a foreign masjid, right? You are not required to get permission from some sort of religious headquarters. So for example, Catholics want to organize a local church, they can't just go out and build a church, right? These things are done hierarchically through the diocese, through the archdiocese, through the bishops. Right? Not so for Muslims. Right? They don't have to get permission from some sort of worldwide Islamic community or ecclesial authority. What it does require is negotiating with the zoning board, local contractors, health and safety inspectors, and those who control traffic ordinances and parking restrictions. It may well be that in other parts of the world, mosques are fundamentally locally organized and administered institutions. This may not be unique to the United States, but it certainly is a part of the United States that helps facilitate the adaptation of Islam to American religious dynamics. All right, the second issue, in particular, that I want to note here, is the community center model of local congregations. Right? Provisions of social services to members, and a center for social and cultural events. When established in this country, right, the Islamic Center is as much a cultural and educational center as it is a place of worship. The institutions usually involve a large community hall, have rooms for things such as cultural programs, religious education, often a Sunday school, wedding parties, things like that. There are spaces for Muslims to congregate socially as well as to pray in ways that are often not typical of mosques in traditional Islamic countries where there are other opportunities for people to gather, right? In this case, in this sense, the mosque in the United States is very much like other types of particularly Christian congregations in the United States. There's worship space, there's educational space, there's social space, there's cultural space. It's one aspect of Islam that has allowed it to adapt to the American context. Right? It's an organizational form that can be adapted to the congregation, and it's less reliant on translocal or transnational authority. Now, it is true, right, that many masjids in this country bring in imams from other parts of the world in order to provide religious instruction, from Pakistan, India, the Middle East, etc. But at least in my own personal experience, as well as in the sociological literature, those leaders are often for religious instruction and not administrative leaders of the mosque as an organization. Right? And so fundamentally in that regard, while the ulama are revered for their knowledge and their teaching, Islam in many ways is a lay-driven religion, and it lends itself to what we would call self-organizing in the United States. And then finally, the last aspect of sort of the organizational dimension of American religion, right, is that organizations arise in civil society that promote the interests and defend the interests and public participation of the group in the wider public. And I've already mentioned a couple of those that work that way in the United States, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Public Affairs Council impact, etc. So in this way, Islam is resonant with the de facto congregationalism that marks much of American religion. There are, of course, translocal Islamic organizations, right? The Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, the Islamic Circle of North America, Muslim Youth of North America, right? That branch of ISNA. These organizations actually, in this country, function much the way that denominations do for Christian groups, such as the UCC or Baptists. They act as a resource for programming, they sponsor conventions, they often have literature that local groups can use, but they are not structures of ecclesiastical authority, right? They don't discipline local congregations the way a Catholic bishop would discipline local congregations. They're not sources of financial support or sponsorship. Local Islamic centers are locally run and locally self-sufficient. They may get help from the outside, but they don't exist without local communities taking a hand in it. It's actually interesting in that regard to note the extent to which the Islamic Society of North America is developed out of the Muslim Student Association. The Muslim Student Association first being founded in 1963, even before these changes in immigration law I referred to earlier, for Muslim students here in the U.S., it grew, it expanded, and soon ISNA was born after it. So in that organizational sense, I think it's true, the old saying that American Islam was born in the MSA. Okay, so I have talked now a little bit about the organizational story of adaptation in American life. Let me talk now about American religious culture. Some of the same developments will be seen here that I mentioned in organizational. Right? One of the things that is notable about American religious culture is that it is local. Right? It is located in the family and in private religious institutions, because the state, at least officially, the government does not sponsor religious organizations, or at least that's what the Constitution says. There's always a little bit of variation, but at least officially, that is the case. Right? What that has meant is that American religious organizations and American religion is fundamentally voluntary, right? And thus authenticated by choice. People explain their religious beliefs and their religious commitments in American culture as much by their own personal choice and decisions that they have made as they explain it based on their background, their families, their ethnicity, etc. I hasten to add, this may not always be perfectly true, as we sociologists have found, that most people do not shift away from the faith that they were born into, or if they do change, they change very little, most people. It's nonetheless true that even when people do not change their religious affiliation, they still describe their religious commitments as one of choice, and one that they made individually, and that makes it authentic. All right. For the second generation, these connections to American religious culture at one hand, and a faith community that involves family on the other, and particularly with mosques as cultural centers, the culture that is being incubated there is often, as my students sometimes say, a matter of living on the hyphen as Muslim Americans. So first is I want to talk now a little bit about my research. Let me refer to, I'm going to come up with a couple of images here from some of the research I personally did that stand out to me. The first one, I was at an MSA meeting at a local university. I was talking with a young Muslim woman who was a student there. I was talking about the MSA with her. She was dressed in both the hijab and also the jilbab, right, the long flowing robe. Her cell phone rings. She answers. She chats excitedly into the phone in English mixed with Arabic, and pulls out another electronic device with her calendar on it in order to arrange a study meeting for one of her pre-med classes. This lets you know this was actually a couple of years ago, since she didn't have it all on one smartphone. She actually had two different electronic devices. Right? So I was struck by the fact that here she was in the Islamic garb that many Americans, many non-Muslim Americans, would think of as a sign of female submissiveness, right? The hijab and the robe. But she's an educated young woman with professional ambitions using the latest in technology. What's more, she's talking with me, an unrelated male, openly and directly, and has, with her cousins, driven her own car to that meeting that night. That image struck me. Second, on several occasions I attended a neighborhood event and festival sponsored by a young adult-run Muslim organization. At one point during this festival, and this happened a couple different times, there were stereos with huge speakers that were blaring music out, as young people are wont to do. I found out how old I was at that very point. And the music was blaring with hip-hop beats. Right? The music and the rhythm were pure urban American. Right? But the lyrics were from the Hadith, right? And from Islamic history. And at the time, when it came to the end of the CD that was playing, there was a recorded message that indicated the music was part of the, quote, Islamic rap series put out by the Muslim Youth of North America, MINA, the National Division of ISNA that sponsors youth activities. So in each of these examples, it was a thoroughly Muslim setting, but in so many ways, it could not have been more American. And my field notes abound with these kind of stories. I went to a suburban mosque one time to observe Quran classes. The teacher was an elderly Pakistani man who spoke virtually no English, but he brought forward several of his star pupils to do recitations for me. One young man was about a junior or a senior in high school, wearing a Chicago Bulls t-shirt. Another about the same age in a high school football jersey. A third boy about 10 or 11 in a New York Yankees baseball cap. So in each of these situations, what could be more American, what could be more Muslim? Now, I'm going to look here at a few more book covers. And I want you to notice a couple of things about these, right? These are all books written more or less as academic books, and in generally, well, with the exception of the one down there at the bottom, written by people who are writing about American Muslims, right? In each case, we notice particularly a focus on women's apparel in each case, right? But contrast those with a number of books written by American Muslim young people, not about them. Right? When we look at this selection of book covers, we get a very different set of mental images. These shows mixtures of classically American images, the Statue of Liberty, the flag, the guitar-playing young man, along with symbols of the faith. Yet another set of books, again, by American Muslims. Right? Now, I don't want to over-interpret book covers. A lot goes into a book cover than just the author's intention. That's certainly the case. Book covers are meant to, of course, communicate a message. They're also meant to sell books, right? So they do contain a message, even if it's only the publisher's perceptions of the market, if nothing else. Nonetheless, the relative differences between the books about Muslims and the books by young American Muslims, at least in my view, is quite striking. So these types of social and cultural situations, right, this between culture situation, involves a significant amount of what I call cultural identity work. Right? And it's work of creating a practical lived expression of American Islam. Two factors, I think, are particularly important in this kind of cultural identity work. The first is religious education. Right? And I mean religious education in two different ways here, and I'll explain more just in a moment. I mean the religious education that, of course, families do with their children. Absolutely. But I also mean the religious education that young adults do with themselves and among themselves when they are gathered together. Right? So this is not just a top-down presentation of the faith from the elders to the young. It's also a young adult activity in and of itself. And then the second thing is the development of Muslim as what we might call a countercultural identity. Right? An identity which, while it fits into the United States and into American culture, it often offers a way of not being quite of the mainstream and being proud of that. These two factors are intertwined and they complement each other. Right? Much religious education happens, of course, because of the work of religiously observant parents And some of our respondents made that exact point. So for example, one young man says, yes, I went to Sunday school. They teach 4 classes. One about the history of the prophet, the Quran, right? How to actually read the Quran, class in theology, basic concepts. We found this over and over, right? Whereas many of the Christian young people we interviewed may have had religious education, may have not. We found it almost uniformly with the young Muslims we discussed. Another example I will give you quite quickly. The interviewer says, so you mentioned you go to summer camps. And this is a different respondent. Says, yeah, from when I was young I go to camps. I think my brother started at age 5, I started about age 7. Back then, the parents would get together and they would organize the camp. This is my emphasis there on the italics. The parents would, again, self-organized, lay-organized situation for American Muslims, right? I used to get homesick, so my parents would come and pick me up. I think the first camp I attended full-time, I was 13, 200 people there. It was really intense. Okay, so alongside these reports of religious education sponsored by families, I want to emphasize, I repeatedly saw examples of religious education even when attending meetings that were only had young adults there. I go to meetings in group, there was always a dar, so about a half an hour talk on some religious or ethical theme, often from an age peer, which I think is very important, who was often treated like a respected elder, not because of their age, but because of their expertise and their knowledge about Islam. And it was almost what I would consider like a 1970s style of consciousness raising among young Muslims themselves. They were educating themselves in their faith and working out how to be Muslims in a non-Muslim society. So we can see both religious education and early stages of a distinctly Muslim social identity among youth, and the attempts at education and clarification that continues through the crucial identity moment. So I want to move to that, the idea how this might be a countercultural identity. Remember that I'm claiming here that young people are trying to negotiate in the context of the U.S. where their parents, it's much different for them, and often maybe their parents may not be able to guide them as much in negotiating American culture as they themselves can guide their parents. So many young American Muslims have wide differences in experience and knowledge with their parents, and some of the social and cultural lessons may not be entirely relevant for them. So at least in part, the countercultural identity developed by young American Muslims has at least some distinction between themselves and their parents. This is from yet a different interview. This is actually a young woman, not a young man. But she gives this talk about how she was relating to her parents' religion. My parents, my family have always been Muslim by culture, which I mean is not always very valid. We go down a couple of sentences, and again, I put the italics in there. You have to make a conscious decision for it to be good religion. This is a very American framing of religion as a conscious choice. So I think my parents were Muslim by culture. It wasn't until later in life that my mother began to cover. And this is a general thing in any Muslim family. So I think there's been like a rise in awareness, Islamic awareness, in my own generation. Now, I have no data on her family. I actually don't know how religious her family might have been. It's not unusual for teenagers to believe they have invented something that they have been around for a while. I certainly believed that when I was 17. I don't think anybody had quite felt things as intensely or understood the world as much as I did at age 18. The older I've gotten, the less I know. But what's important here is that she is framing this as a distinction between her parents' culture and her own. I have seen countless discussions among young adult Muslims trying to tease out the important parts of theological practices and important religious knowledge. Even when they do not have the knowledge, they still frame their debates within the terms of theology and understanding Islamic teachings correctly. Right? In American culture, religion is what we call an achieved status, attained after a conscious, deliberate decision, not a birthright. And as we see in this quote, choice is a valued criterion for identity. But as they are defining themselves against, and sometimes in distinction with their parents, also with distinction to their, what they see as the dominant American culture and their age group peers, right? So this is, let me set this up for you. I was visiting an Islamic school. I was talking to a number of students that were in the range of about 16 to age 19, and I was asking them specifically about the challenges of trying to be Muslim in America. I asked them whether there were challenges to be trying to be Muslim in America. One of the students at first denied that it was any problem at all. There's no problem being a Muslim in America. The U.S., he said, has a great tradition of diversity and tolerance, and one that is free to follow any religion. So I reframed what I was asking a little bit. I said, well, but American culture has historically been not just Christian, but Protestant, and it remains most comfortable for Protestants, perhaps. With this, the students heartily agreed. They reported varying degrees of knowing they were different. Again, my emphasis there. Knowing they were different, of learning to negotiate that differences. One example, worrying about missing the bus for a high school scout game because he had to go pray. Having to be clear that Muslims don't drink or date in the same way that non-Muslim youth do, and how that can produce a great deal of tension. Several noticed that the challenge was too great for many Muslim youth, and they were indeed dating or using drugs or not dressing modestly, etc. But in addition, these students also noted they had some tension with their first-generation parents. In this case, all 4 students were second generation. In their view, this had both positive and negative aspects. They did claim that it was allowing them to follow a purer or truer Islam, unburdened with much of the cultural baggage that their parents and their families have. They seem to indicate their intense interest in religion and religious education put them at odds with their parents, like the quote that I had just shown before. At about this time, one of the teachers strolled up, a fairly young man. He reiterated that Islam in America was, this was his word, liberated from Arab and Indian culture, and thus the move to the U.S. was producing a purified form of the religion. Right? I noted that the English North American colonists back in the day were founded by people who came here to establish a purer form of their own Protestant Christianity, and several students and the teacher voiced assent, and one said, yes, Muslims are in that American tradition. Thus, being a Muslim in America is a challenge, they concluded. And at one point, the student who first denied that it was a problem said, well, I should recant what I said earlier. It's a challenge we face every day, but a challenge that they should welcome religiously. The surrounding society gives them more challenges to overcome to keep their religious self pure, and they have the opportunity to produce a truer Islam in that way. The sociologist in me notes how interesting it is that these young adult Muslims are separating religion from culture in many ways and trying to find what is truly Islamic as distinct from what is cultural, but in many ways they are substituting American cultural understandings, which they have grown up with, such as the idea that religion is fundamentally about choice, for their parents' Arab or Pakistani or South Asian cultural distinctions. In sum, second and third generation Muslim Americans are doing personal and collective identity work as they establish themselves in this country, distinct from their parents' culture and distinct from non-Muslim peers. They're creating an American Islam on the ground. And I'm going to conclude here with a recent painting. This is by a New Jersey-based Pakistani American, an artist named Asma Ahmed Siko, and it's titled Self-Portrait Number 1. Right? There are actually 3 versions of this painting. One's called Self-Portrait 1, one's called Self-Portrait 2, the other one's Self-Portrait 3. But she calls the whole series home. Right? I think that's really revealing. The artist has placed herself here in the guise of one of America's most noted icons, the Statue of Liberty. It's associated with immigration, with liberty, with new beginnings. And yet she renders it notably South Asian. The face is proud, perhaps just a bit defiant. The expression certainly determined. The features are bold and well-defined with eyes that are wide open. For me, it is wonderfully evocative of the American Islam currently emerging among the second generation. I'm going to end with the words from one of my respondents. These are her words. My mother says to me, "You're outside maybe American, but at heart you are Indian." But I say, "No, Mom. The icing may be Indian, but the cake is American." Thank you all very much, and I'm eager to hear some questions.
Thank you very, very much. We'll now have questions.
I have something to say.
Please.
It's not a question. It's not a question, but I'm just hoping our children will start to understand the difference between this religion, Islam religion, and the culture. Because it's 1400 years ago, and it's becoming old, and people start following the religion, unfortunately, in our homes, in India, and all over this Muslim world, and a lot of them just following this religion culture, not the understanding of really this religion. And it hurts. But our children maybe will understand better. I hope.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that comment. I actually think there's a very interesting. I'm not, again, you all are not. I don't have to tell you, I'm not Muslim, right? That's clear to you all. But I do want to repeat. I actually feel very optimistic about Islam in the United States. I think we have seen a number of examples, many examples, and I showed a couple of them, of significant religious education which happens in the home and that carries on so that when young adults are among themselves, many of them, and certainly not all of them, sociologists can't predict everything, but for many of them, they continue to work very hard to try to figure out ways to remain faithful. And I mean, American culture is a challenge not just to Muslims, it's a challenge to faithful Christians, it's a challenge. When I was with Hindu youth, many of them told me the same thing, right? That they were trying to learn how to be Hindu in a way that they thought was more faithful than their parents or the surrounding culture. I'm impressed with the seriousness with which young adult Muslims take this task and with the ways in which Islam is organized both in its family and organizationally to help them with it. So, and now, it may be the case that I personally don't see as many students who stray from the faith. Right? The ones who are more interested in my classes in the sociology of religion are more interested in religion. Loyola has a very active MSA, and I know a number of those students. So it may be that I'm seeing the ones who have particularly stayed involved. But as a sociologist, and I have no particular stake in this one way or the other, I would feel very optimistic about young people and young Americans and young American Muslims. I think that they are working very hard to be faithful at the same time they're looking to succeed in this country. Yes, please, sir.
My name is Muhammad Salim Mukhtar. I'm the National Director for AMT, American Muslim Task Force. One thing which came out to me, I perceive it's very powerful, from your presentation, the notion that America, living in America, American culture has helped, that statement which I could paraphrase again because I don't remember exactly, that what you brought that statement from one of the interviewees.
Oh, yes.
That America liberated me from the culture which was infested into the religion. I think that is very, very powerful, very powerful, and I see it, and it's not a predictions, but I hope to see that right now in our discourse we talk about, okay, there is a Saudi influence, there is the Iranian influence,
right,
vice versa, and I can foresee that in the future, American society will provide those two services. Not only that it will liberate the Muslims, the believers, from the, if I may use the word, I don't know if it is a proper, the molestation of culture
Mhm.
with the faith.
Mhm.
So it would be more, I think it would be more pure form of,
Mhm.
And second, for the same reason, I think America has the opportunity not only to lead in many other spheres like economic or military, but to lead in the faith one. And I look forward to that the Muslim community would be the leaders of the, so to speak, Muslim Ummah or the Muslim Islamic nation, or how we describe that as the Ummah. So what's your take on that one?
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. As soon as I will, of course, talk from my understanding. I do this with a little concern because I'm talking to experts in the faith here, whereas I'm not an expert in the faith. I'm an expert in sociology, right? But it seems to me that in the concept of the Ummah, the universal Muslim community, one of the things that Muslims consistently have tried to work out is the ways in which ethnic and national and racial differences intersect with Muslim identity, right? And so in many ways, the Ummah is an ideal in which being Muslim is the first identity and your nationality and your race and other things are second, right? Or third, etc. I think the United States is not only a multi-religious community, but a multiracial and a multi-ethnic society has the opportunity to present that, or at least the opportunity to take it for the Muslim community to take advantage of that. I'm not for a minute denying the extent to which American society is driven by racial differences, driven by ethnic differences, driven by religious discrimination. That's absolute, those things are absolutely true. But what's also true is there's an ideal that those kinds of differences can be transcended. And I think that opportunity is as available for American Islam as in other places. I have colleagues who are sociologists who are themselves Muslim who are studying the ways in which in individual mosques, Pakistanis and Arabs and Nigerians and so on interact, and the extent to which perhaps racial differences can be overcome. I think it's true in the United States that the difference between the Islam of immigrant generations and African American Islam, I think that difference is less than it used to be. It hasn't closed completely. It's less than it used to be. I never think history changes immediately, but I think that there's reason. I think there's reason to be optimistic about that. Not that it won't be work. Yes, please.
My question has to do with your statement that you found that various community centers are more or less independently run in the Islamic center, points to their more democratic leanings versus a centralized authority, which is conversely true of the Christians and Protestants. That in certain parts of their activities, they do seek guidance or are just supervised by a central authority.
Yeah.
And linked to that, is this a weakness or a positive from your vantage point as a sociologist? And lastly, from your understanding of Islam, what you see being practiced, are there certain discordant features that you sort of don't agree with personally, and still, as a sociologist, you observe them happening among the Muslim community? Thank you very much.
Those are good questions. Those are very good questions. The first one about it. Yes, I do think there is that strain of what we could call democratic practice in Islam that is particularly associated with local organization and locally run organizations. And I'm not saying that it's always true, but I do think that sort of localness rather than a centralized authority, I think it tends to lead to a more lay or a little more lay religion, a religion that's run more by the people in it. I think that that's one of the reasons that Islam is adapting quite quickly in the United States, as opposed to, in some ways, Hinduism or Buddhism. Well, Hinduism is actually, I think, adapting quite quickly, but not at the organizational level. Hinduism is adapting quickly because most Hindu practices end up happening in the home. And so, but Hindu temples are not playing as big a role in organized Hindu life as mosques are in organized Islamic life. So I think that is overall a strength. It does produce a situation, as with Protestant Christianity, where many different interpretations of the faith and of the practice may in fact spring up. And Protestant Christianity in this country has a long history of conflict, division, rival interpretations that people often get quite heated about. On the other hand, the United States is kind of made to allow a certain amount of religious diversity and pluralism. And if I were an economist, I would talk about the United States, the religious scene in the United States as having what they would call low barriers to entry. Meaning that if you want to start your own local congregation, you can do so. You don't have to ask the government, and you don't have to ask higher religious authorities. You just do so. I can start one in my living room if I want to. To that extent, I think that is an organizational and will eventually be a cultural strength of American Islam. The variety of interpretation often produces conflict. I think in the long run, American culture contains that conflict. And then the second one, now I'm not sure if there was the second question I'm having trouble with, but the third question I remember about questions you were asking me about what I've seen as practices that I assess normatively. I have seen practices in some Muslim settings where there was a very strict and a very clear gender segregation some gender segregation I actually think is quite healthy as young women and young men begin to form identities, strengthen identities in their peers. But I have seen at least some examples of gender segregation that I think will disadvantage young people once they get into a work world that is highly gender integrated, when they're working all the time with people of different genders. And I think that has the potential to be a problem. It's not just a Muslim issue. Among some forms of evangelical Protestant Christianity, there's also a lot of gender segregation, and I think that has some implications for success in education and professional organizations as well. So that would be one thing. That would be one thing that I would see as a potential barrier for the economic and social mobility of it. I've also been in settings where I thought that the interactions between young Muslim men and women were not overly, while there was some differentiation, it was not overly strict, and it didn't seem overly hostile either. So I particularly worry about the extent to which sometimes I think young men get the message that young women are not to be trusted. And I think that is a potentially dangerous message to give young men. And I forgot your second point, and I'm sorry.
No, that's your covered it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
I think we had a question here, and then.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please, Doctor.
All right. Thank you very much. Very educational
Oh, good.
lecture. I'm not socialist, I'm an Islamist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Muslim too, will tell you the points which I know you're concerned, which for a Muslim not a concern.
Mm-hmm.
Racial diversity, linguistic diversity, cultural, actually is basic in Islam. The Quran, God speaks that, He said, we created you different in colors and languages and races so that you are equal. The Prophet is elaborated in that too. So Muslims, wherever they go, we have the experience when they went to Southeast Asia, Africa. No Muslim armies when they're actually individuals, merchants, Sufis, whatever. And and they mixed, mingled, and they created a Muslim society which culturally adapted the culture of the place. Because us Muslims here, we dress differently. Pakistanis, Indians, Arabs, and all people coming from wherever, and the food and our culture. So in American, we avoid the taboos like drinking and pork and stuff like that. So we have no problem integrating with the even interfaith marriages between Muslim men and Jewish and Christian women. Actually, that's an opening to for the Muslim to integrate easily in the American society. Then we come to the political issue now. That's the troubles. But we will, as soon as we have a strong lobby in Washington, we will be accepted. So I didn't see that really we're facing a problem as you think that. And those strict Muslim in the mosque, the boys there and girls, actually we are working in it to break that. I mean, really, let's say the scholars stepping in to stop that kind of thing. That there's nothing that total segregation. So all that avoid temptation, avoid but under control activities that started working out in Sunday schools and full-time schools. So I think that really would be the future of Muslims here.
Well, and that's a very positive and optimistic read. I can see that easily. And from my own perspective, one of the things I personally enjoy about my own research is the ethnic and cultural diversity among different types of Muslims. I actually find that really interesting. And personally, one of the things I appreciate about the United States is the overall cultural diversity. It's one of the reasons I like to live in Chicago, right? So now it does seem to me that over the past, I would say 30 to 40 years, the power and the money of certain interpretations of Islam, particularly coming out of Saudi Arabia, have often been exported to other places, right? I mean, certain Wahhabist kind of interpretations of society. It seems to me those work less well in the United States, where there has been a long history of sort of internal diversity. So I think that that's one of the things that Muslims will be working out for themselves in this country. I'm just here to observe that as that happens.
Thank you very much. We have one question over here, and that will be the last question.
Okay.
Hello, doctor.
Sure.
Wait, hold on.
Hello.
There we go.
Hi, doctor. I have to disagree with you on what you say is the negation of Wahhabi influence in this country. Young people, from what I have observed, and I spend a lot of time with young people, I'm not a Wahhabi though, do tend to look at these lecturers who are eloquent in English, who understand American culture, but are backed and funded by Saudi Arabia and platforms that Saudi Arabia creates. And Wahhabism has been very prevalent in the West since the 1970s, and Saudi Aramco getting switched over to the Saudi government, it allowed them to build a lot of masjids and do a lot of dawah work. So I would have to, which brings me to a question. How do American converts, specifically post 9/11 American converts, fit into this paradigm of Islamic Americana?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No. That's a very interesting question. And in a version of the paper, which was larger than the talk I could give tonight, actually, there are several examples of places where what I call Euro converts, meaning they were basically European American. Partly because in those situations, it's so clear that they made a choice, that they are learning things from the ground up, that they're negotiating sort of their home culture and so on. That's a particularly interesting. It's a particularly interesting case. What I hear in those situations is again this sort of religion versus culture language, but the culture being referenced is, in some cases, it's their parents, but it's also what they consider often sort of a morally degenerate culture of mainstream materialists, you know, American TV, you know, American capitalist consumer culture. So I do think some of those same dynamics go on. What seems to me to be less prevalent for the Euro convert is just in terms of numbers, they are less likely, at least in my own observations, they're less likely to have a community, right? So much of the time they spend, at least in my observations, are with people who grew up in Muslim families and Muslim cultures. And so they may, for the convert, there may be a particular kind of religion versus cultural dilemma where they have less to fall back on. So I'll give one, and I know I'm running late, but let me give one example here. I was at a local masjid. I went to hear a talk from an out-of-town sheikh who was going to talk about marriage and dating and how to do that Islamically, right? And so I was there. It was interesting. There were at least as many parents there as there were young people, because parents wanted to learn how to do this as well, right? Because they're facing a different culture of dating here. And so a young woman who was clearly a convert was saying, well, what do you do when you don't have a father who's a Muslim to sort of supervise your interactions with young men? And frankly, the sheikh was kind of surprised. And so he thought about it, he talked about it back and forth, and I think he came up with some ways to think about this that was useful for the young woman, but it's clear that was not the preeminent example in his mind. And so I think that's a particular issue for people who are sort of coming out of a culture as individuals rather than coming out of a culture as a peer group. Listen, thank you all very much.
Dr. Williams, we have here a little gift for you.
Oh my goodness.
Token of our appreciation. This is an original piece of artwork. It's
Oh my
called
goodness.
Ebru, which is the Turkish form of water marbling. So one of our
No, I saw this on your website. Well, this is gorgeous. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I really quite touched. Thank you very much. Oh, this is beautiful. Does this? Ebru, E-B-R-U. This will go in my office. Thank you all very much.